And this next question refers to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. It says long-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when which of the following is true? And it says A is aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply. B is aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long-run supply curve. C is unemployment equals zero, and D is output is above potential GDP. And so, what this is really going to refer to is the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model, and that's going to be most memorable as one of those graphs that you just have to be familiar with and know how to interact with, right? So we can refer to that over here. I'll just draw out what the AD dynamic ADAS graph would look like. So we have price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis, and then we have first let's do a straight line, and this is I'll look at the top, long run aggregate supply. We're gonna have short run aggregate demand, or not short run, just regular aggregate demand. Well, although we typically think about this in the short run because aggregate demand doesn't have a long run value, and then intersecting at the exact same point we have short run aggregate supply. And so this is what we would say is the long run condition for the aggregate the dynamic aggregate demand aggregate supply model. And the reason is because all three lines we have are intersecting at the same place. Short run aggregate supply refers to in the near term where some variables are fixed. What does the aggregate supply look like? Aggregate demand is again in the short term because demand is pretty dependent on certain factors that are always variable. And a long run aggregate supply refers to if we find all supply variables to be, or supply factors to be variable, what is the full potential output of the economy, aka potential GDP, right? And so if we maximize production, what would in the long run, what would we expect GDP to be? And so for us to have them all intersecting implies that we are currently in the long run because our current GDP production level is the exact same as the long run aggregate supply potential GDP, and that is what we refer to as the long run equilibrium. And in the long run, we wouldn't expect any changes to this kind of system, right? To have this relationship, there is no reason that we expect deviation from this equilibrium unless one of the curves were to shift again. And this can be differentiated, from the short run aggregate supply curve, which can look something like this, right? Or not short run aggregate supply curve, but a short run equilibrium, which can look anything like this. We still have our long run aggregate supply. And then instead of having an intersection on the long run aggregate supply curve, we might have intersection a little bit before or a little bit after, right? And so both of these are possible intersection points, and this would be what is known as contractionary gap, and this would be expansionary gap. And essentially saying in the short run, GDP is not the same as potential GDP that we would see in the long run, and therefore there's some sort of deviation, and we would know that we are in the short run because the economy cannot sustain output at either of these levels because they would be either inefficient or just impossible to do. And so that's kind of the way we want to think about the dynamic aggregate supply aggregate demand model. So keeping all that in mind, we can go back to our answer choices, and it becomes clear that answer choice B is going to be the best answer choice for our needs. It says aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long run aggregate supply curve. And so again, we have our short run equilibrium intersection is the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply, and then our long run equilibrium is going to be the straight line, and if they both coincide, then we have what is known as the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said B, aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, and they intersect at a point on the long run supply curve. And they said in the long run, GDP is determined where short run aggregate demand curve and short run supply curve and long run in the supply curve all meet at one single point. Long run equilibrium is stable and struck after GDP gaps are liquidated, implying that in the long run actual GDP must coincide the potential GDP. when there's a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium in the current economy, current GDP is equal to long-run potential GDP, and that there is no inflation. Okay, so some grammar issues. We're going to rewrite some of this to make it a little bit more clear. Grammar issues. So in the long, we say long run aggregate supply is represented by V, and it's great that they included this graph, which is super helpful. So by the vertical line on the graph, and is defined as the potential GDP of the economy, assuming it is operating at full capacity with all factors variable. And then short run aggregate supply, and so short run equilibrium occurs when short run aggregate supply is equal to intersects aggregate demand. Long run equilibrium occurs when this intersection occurs at a point on the long run aggregate supply curve. If this long run equilibrium means there are no, means, yeah, so we're going to rephrase that last sentence, which is pretty good. Means current GDP is equal to potential GDP, and there are no inflationary or recessionary gaps at this time. And so that's going to be a probably more a more accurate solution with some of the clarity issues figured out. But otherwise, I'm going to add a great graph because that's really, really helpful. I think it'd be really hard to understand this answer solution without drawing a graph, or without at least knowing about this graph. And so it's great to include that. And so otherwise, the solution is correct. And so we're going to mark this as all good.